to another edition of Outro, the show about shows, the show dealing with shows, right here on the writer Albert Lanier channel. I, of course, am the writer Albert Lanier, and here with another edition of Outro. Uh, and so, this episode, we're going to deal with a recent interview. In fact, I did it last night. Interview where I returned to the Reserved Seats show on YouTube. You can find that on the Deleted Scenes channel. That's the Deleted Scenes channel. And the name of the show, of course, is Reserved Seats. I had done my first interview on Reserved Seats, I think a couple months ago or a few months ago, when I was on my promotional tour promoting my Substack newsletters, Final Cut, and of course, Retro Review. And I was back to promote Retro Review itself, which of course is my film review newsletter. And the Retro Review and Film actually it's called a Final Cut and Retro Review publications page on Facebook. So I was there to promote both Retro Review and the Final Cut Retro Review publications page on Facebook. So again, much like I had the first time, I had a pretty nice time on Reserved Seats and got to talk about movies. And one of the things I wanted to come back to the show because when I was there previously, I had to go talk about my background and being a journalist and being a writer and all of that. But this was, and to a certain extent, I talked about movies, but I wanted to talk more about movies and get into primarily some of the reviews of movies I've done and movies that, and what the intent or the mission plan, I guess you could say, of Retro Review is. Because as anyone who's been to the newsletter knows or understands, the newsletter is about advocacy for movies, more specifically for movies that are either little known, barely known or unknown, or forgotten. And so that's the whole purview of Retro Review. So it isn't just movies from the past. It's movies from the past that I think should get a bigger audience or an audience, period. And that's the whole point of Retro Review as a newsletter. So it's advocacy. It's not just merely analysis or dissection. So that was really important. And I got into some movies. I talked about some movies. Psycho 2 was one that I got to talk about. A movie that I thought was a real sequel and is a real sequel. Of course, it's the thumbnail for this episode of Outro. So I really feel, not feel, but I know that Psycho 2, for example, is really a real sequel. It's not unlike a lot of sequels to movies. You look at that movie, and one of the things I noted in the interview last night was that it's a movie where, and I had noted this in my review, where you had a sympathetic antagonist. More often than not, the protagonist is the one that's sympathetic in a movie. But this is a sympathetic antagonist, which is what Norman Bates is in Psycho 2. The audience basically is, I don't know, maneuvered is quite the word for it, but the audience, I think, is induced to sympathize with Norman Bates in the sequel. Whereas in the first film, he, of course, eventually ends up being the major malefactor, the so-called villain. Here, he is the victim, not the villain. So that's one of the fascinating things to me about Psycho 2, is the movie just kind of completely overturns expectations. And even years later, many years later, it overturns projections. And that was a movie that actually did pretty well. It did pretty well at the box office at the time. But unfortunately, it's been forgotten. People will talk about it in regards to Anthony Perkins films, right? And they'll talk about it maybe in regards to reference it in regards to Hitchcock. Maybe not his Psycho, but they'll maybe mention that, oh, there was a sequel many years later. But Psycho 2 is a sequel that deserves to be seen by far more people. And I think it deserves to be placed on the same level as the original Psycho. I think it's every bit as good a movie as the original Psycho was. And I also talked a little about some other movies. I mentioned Real Genius, an excellent movie. That was the actual first review for the newsletter, which was a spin-off. Retro Review was a spin-off of a section on Final Cut, my other newsletter. So Real Genius, a great movie from 1985 starring Val Kilmer, was the first review for the newsletter. A wonderful movie. It's one of my favorite movies from one of my favorite comedies from the 1980s. Love that movie. There was another movie I also reviewed, kicking that newsletter off. It was a movie called Porky's Revenge, which I gave a 1-star review to, and which I think is utterly and completely garbage, trash. Just a bad movie. And so it was nice to be able to kind of talk movies. Not that it's something I'm not doing. I don't really get to talk as much about movies when I've been doing interviews. I did a promotional tour, earlier this year, and so more often than not, you're going over kind of the same territory. You're talking about yourself and your background as a writer. In my case, as a writer, as a journalist. So it's very interesting. But I had a good time last night on Reserved Seats, and talking about movies, and talking a little about YouTube. We did get to talk a little about YouTube, which is interesting. But enjoyed really. The reason I had been on Reserved Seats is I was invited to come on the show. What was it, about 3 or 4 months ago, or wherever it was, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. I forget when, August, September. And that's how I ended up on the show. Had a good time and came back. Another good discussion. It's part of trying to finish up all my sort of media interviews, trying to get the last interviews done for 2025 and ushering in the year. So very interesting. It was a good experience for me being back on Reserved Seats. I don't know how many views that the interview will get. Hopefully it'll get quite a few. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. I think it's an hour and a half long show, so it's a bit of a long show. But check it out. It's on the Deleted Scenes channel. The name of the show, Reserved Seats. The name of the channel on YouTube, Deleted Scenes. The name of the guest, Albert Lanier. And the name of this channel, writer Albert Lanier. And of course, the name of the show, Outro. And that is the outro for Outro. And I'll see you later, folks.